And you're trying to give the young people something that will help them, yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Thanks for tuning into the podcast once again. My name is Drew Perkins. I'm the director of TeachThought Professional Development, and as many schools are reverting back to virtual learning, not in-person learning around the world, I wanted to remind you that our workshops are available in an online format in almost all cases. We certainly look forward to resuming on-site workshops, hopefully in the spring as we emerge from this COVID pandemic. But in the event that you are looking for help with teaching and learning, either with project-based learning or inquiry or other areas in which we specialize, or our effective online teaching workshop, which of course is held online, please feel free to reach out or to contact us through our website, wegrowteachers.com. And if you are looking for on-site workshops in the spring, we are scheduling those starting in the spring and summer if you want to reach out through the website as well. One last note, I did want to make sure that folks were aware of our Asynchronous Pbl on-demand video courses that can be purchased for individuals who might be interested in our PBL workshops but are part of a school that is not engaging in group workshops. And that can be found by going to wegrowteachers.com/PBL on demand. In this episode, I spoke with Maggie Kline, who is the author of a new book called Brain-Changing Strategies to Trauma-Proof Our Schools, subtitle A Heart-Centered Movement for Wiring Well-Being. And this conversation centered, of course, on trauma and how it affects our students and teachers and teaching and learning, heavily on resilience factors and some discussion around the idea of trauma or resilience being on a spectrum and the relation of trauma to resilience, as well as a connection of formative years to cognitive and emotional empathy and other pieces around this very important issue. Interesting conversation, and again, a very important topic to be thinking about in the current day and age, as we certainly have lots of students who are experiencing some levels of anxiety and trauma based on the lockdowns from COVID. So I hope this conversation is helpful. Maggie, welcome to the podcast. As always, I like to give our guests an opportunity to share a little bit of information about your background and what you do and maybe what you have done and what you're passionate about. I know we're going to talk about trauma and schools and education and teaching and learning, but give our listeners a little bit of background on who you are.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for inviting me to this opportunity, Drew. And I started teaching in 1969, believe it or not, in Alaska. And I taught high school and elementary school before moving to Southern California. And I had a baby with my husband in Southern California and decided I wanted to get a California teaching credential and ended up with a very lovely and long career in Long Beach Unified School District. But I noticed so many changes over the years. I'd say I'm privileged because of my age to see how things have changed. And there were so many traumatized kids that I started working with that had problems with regulation. They were acting out or withdrawn or absent, not coming to school. And I somehow ended up getting the reputation of she's the teacher who can handle these kids. I don't know how or why, except that I just love these kids. I just felt maybe something inside of me felt unsupported growing up. Even though I had lovely parents, we had some tragedies in the family that created a situation where my parents had to give the attention to that situation. And I just wanted to support these kids. I saw they didn't have a lot of supports at home. And it wasn't necessarily due to the parents didn't love them, but I worked always in poverty areas where there might be a single parent struggling to put food on the table. And so it was difficult, but I like challenges. And I realized that, instead of focusing on the schoolwork itself, like if a child was struggling with a math problem, if I could go over and just put my hand on their shoulder, and instead of focusing on the red mark on the paper or the error, to actually look at the child in the eyes and say something kind, that the children were encouraged to do their best and didn't feel so frustrated. And that was in the easy days. That was the early days in the 70s in Long Beach. And then we had the advent of so many refugees from Central America and from Vietnam and Cambodia, and children that didn't speak English. The challenges grew, children with less resources, and children coming from war. And I decided that I really loved helping parents, and I really loved helping the kids, and I decided to be a school counselor and subsequently a school psychologist, so that I can be in a position where I didn't have to teach spelling anymore or phonics. That I never did well in phonics myself. As a school student, I just learned how to read before I went to school, so I skipped phonics, and I never did understand those little nuances that so many schools emphasize. I was looking at the whole child and ended up not only becoming a school psychologist, but a marriage family therapist. And I was hired at some days to go back as a marriage family therapist. I did part-time school psychology and part-time acting as a family therapist. But I still didn't know enough. That until I studied with Dr. Peter Levine, who, I don't know if you've heard of him, Drew. Have you ever heard of Dr. Peter Levine?
Yeah, vaguely familiar with the name, yes, but not deeply familiar with his work.
Yeah, well, he's internationally famous with social workers, psychologists, and medical professionals, anyone that works with trauma, whether it be physical or emotional, because they go hand in hand. In somatic experiencing, the work he taught me, everything happens inside the body, and then it affects the mind. People don't realize that, but our gut instinct is really a real thing, and we have a gut brain, a network of fibers that inform our heart brain, the network of fibers, and the brain that people think of is the white matter inside of the head, the white matter and the gray matter. But we actually have as much white matter in our enteric nervous system as a cat's brain. And if you have cats, they can be pretty smart. So I teach people how to work with and children how to access the parts of their brain that go haywire when they're stressed out.
Okay.
And I love it. I'm passionate about it because it changes people without them having to struggle.
Right. And you have a new book that is entitled, and this is a lot of words here, Brain Changing Strategies to Trauma-Proof Our Schools, a Heart-Centered Movement for Wiring Well-Being. And I know this is, at least as far as I'm aware, is fairly recently published. When was the publishing date?
November 3rd.
Okay, so very recent.
It came out on Election Day.
Right, an infamous day, right?
Infamous day.
Speaking of trauma, right? So as I think about trauma and exploring the ways in which this affects people's lives and students' lives, and how teachers and schools, in many ways have been forced into situations of acting sort of as a proxy for parenting and good family units. And we can talk about whether or debate or argue whether that's healthy or how long that's sustainable. But the reality is that there is some sort of parental role that is sort of thrust on teachers, even in the lightest ways. So trauma being a piece of that, and how students bring that to the classroom. I think it's probably best to start with a definition of what trauma is and what trauma is not.
Okay, that's really simple. Trauma is, I'll start with what it's not. It's not the event itself. It's not the magnitude of the natural disaster and the displacement. It's not the attack, the assault, or the rape, or the molestation. It's how the person, whether they be an adult or a child's nervous system, is able to digest the horrible thing that happened and rebound to some sense of normalcy, how it bounces back. Trauma resides in the nervous system. It doesn't reside in the event. So, for example, when I helped after the Southeast Asian tsunami, I actually spent a month. I brought a team to work with the people in Thailand, in the hardest hit community. And the ones that bounced back and came out of a shock state rather quickly and started mobilizing their community to rebuild, they were the ones that had good resilience to begin with. They were the adults in the community that belonged to a spiritual community, whether it be a Sangha, a meditation community, or a Christian community, or a Muslim community. They had great faith, and they worked together. They were fisher families that worked together, and shopkeepers in the tourist industry, and they worked close to nature. So they were literally there at the ocean and the sea of, actually it was the Andamar Sea. They worked literally with the ocean and the sand, and nearby with the beautiful nature. And because they had resilience to start with, especially the adults and older children, they bounced back. We sometimes had 1 to 3 sessions that we call first aid sessions to bring them out of the shock of trauma so they could start singing, talking, grocery shopping, rather than being frozen and immobilized, sitting huddled in the huts that were rebuilt by the military. We literally saw people with eyes glazed over like they had seen ghosts. And in fact, there were quite a few spirits that were hanging out. I didn't get to visit any, but my colleagues, out of the 9 of us, 7 people actually felt the spirits still lingering, not resting in peace, because the tragedy happened so fast. So I had colleagues that went to Louisiana after the Katrina hurricane, the same colleagues, and they had less success with the folks from New Orleans. They worked actually in New Orleans, and I think the reason was because the government didn't act fast to support. People need supports. So many of the people were impoverished and struggling with traumatic conditions that caused lack of resilience in the first place. And so it was more difficult to help them. So we have to look at resilience factors. And the younger the child, less resilience they have, simply by the nature of their inability to fight or run or find resources. They're dependent on the adults in their life, the parents and the teachers, to build those resources, because children that have had, for instance, a difficult womb experience because there was fetal distress, they need extra support when they're first born in order to help build a circuitry for resilience. If you want to know more about the circuitry, I'd be glad to tell you. I try to do neuroscience made easy. I try to do the cliff notes of the neuroscience that I think is essential for every educator to know.
Yeah, well, so I'm looking at the book, and one of the things that stood out to me was a sentence that you have: trauma is the antithesis of empowerment. And that strikes me as interesting. And you also go on in that same paragraph to note something about genetic predisposition, which I'm wondering is connected to this thread as well. And what do you mean by genetic predisposition?
Well, I think I'm not sure which chapter that's in, but in the final chapter, I talk about epigenetics, which are even more important. And there's been a lot of research in the last I don't know exactly when it started becoming popularized, but maybe the last decade or even less. And there could be a genetic predisposition, but the genes get turned on and turned off dependent on the environment. So if there's a lot of intergenerational trauma and there's been no repair or intervention to help that family or those children, they will have a tendency to recreate the trauma of the past. In other words, they'll be susceptible to the same types of how could I put it, weaknesses. I don't mean character weaknesses, I mean fragility, like in the sense of being prone to depression or suicide or aggression. They will carry out that genetic code, but they don't need to. It all depends on the environment that surrounds them and provides them with a different experience than their parents and their grandparents and maybe great-grandparents had. If they don't have new experiences, the genetic code will continue to create the same tendencies.
Interesting.
Does that make sense? Was that clear enough?
Yeah, so when you're saying sort of genetic predisposition, would it be somewhat analogous to like somebody being genetically predisposed to, alcoholism or, some version of something like that?
Yeah, suicidality, depression, addiction. But it's not, it doesn't have to, that part of the genetic code does not have to be activated. So it's not a life sentence. It's not a determination. Okay. The determination really comes from what happens from the adults around that child, mm-hmm. and how that child is supported or unsupported.
Right. So I want to explore a little bit more the sort of what trauma means and what it doesn't mean, if that's okay. And one of the things that again, that you'd written in, it's on page 30, I don't know what chapter it is technically, but talking about a brief history of trauma and its causes, and you note in the first sentence here is, everywhere we look these days, the word trauma pops up, which I certainly agree with, and it does seem to be sort of a buzzword of the moment. There's lots of things that might be trauma-inducing, perhaps more so in the last few years than in the more dated history, and that may be arguable. But that being said, I wonder, is it best to look at the sort of concept of trauma as being on a spectrum, as being more traumatic or less traumatic, or are there things that don't qualify for sort of traumatic events in the sense of that they might cause dysfunction or problems emotionally that often are sort of being labeled as trauma, and sort of, I guess, maybe that balance between being the reality of real trauma and real traumatic events, and sort of the other side of that, or an other side of it might be sort of a victimhood culture where there's some sort of currency being placed on being a victim.
Oh, that's a long question. Let me see if I can tease that apart. First of all, I wouldn't put events that can trigger trauma on a continuum. I would put chronology and resources of the person on a continuum. For example, a baby that has a rough early start because they had birth and medical emergencies. And while the nervous system, the parts of the nervous system for resilience and social engagement, what we call social engagement, or the ability to feel good about oneself and to make friends. We'll talk about it in terms of kids, okay? Mm-hmm. Those fibers that myelinate the ventral vagal branch of the nervous system that help the child to have a good self-concept, because that child is grounded in feeling held and contained by loving, self-regulated adults. That's going to be a very different child than a child that had a rough early start and maybe even wasn't wanted and was abused. So it's on a continuum of what kind of supports the child received and what happened to them before they were able to develop the circuitry for making friends, which is our first defense against harm, and the circuitry for fight and flight, for actually being able to escape when something's dangerous. So babies are the most vulnerable, and I would say children under 7 are extremely vulnerable. But the first 18 months of life after birth are critical in developing that circuitry. So the most fragile period is the womb period till about 18 months. So if a teacher gets a child in preschool or kindergarten or 5th grade or 9th grade, and they didn't have the essentials to develop that circuitry for resilience, those are the kids on the continuum that are going to have the most trauma in their system. And they might not even act out. They might actually be dissociated, which means they space out in class. They're depressed. Mm-hmm. Maybe they don't come to school. And they don't stand out like the children that are actively disrupting the class. So there's a continuum of nervous system resilience and nervous system, I would say, lack of resilience, so that they're either highly activated and shut down most of the time, and when they do come out, they come out irritated or anxious. When their nervous system, they start to have a good day, and then all of a sudden they struggle with panic attacks. Because the nervous system is designed for survival. We're no different than the other creatures, except that we have a neocortex that gets in the way of us shaking off, literally allowing ourselves to cry when we're frightened, to be held and to be vulnerable, and to let our bodies do what they need to do when they're frightened. If something really happens, like, so we shake and we tremble to let off the excess adrenaline when the event is over. And that's a good stress inoculation. It's a good stress inoculation to be able to cry and to tremble after something terrible happens and it's over, to release the stress hormones and the imprint of the memory of those stress hormones, of how they react. It's a trajectory. It's a whole cascade of chemical and hormones that are released. And children that are chronically stressed because of their circumstances in either their neighborhoods or their homes, from the time that they're babies they're the ones on the continuum of trauma that are the most traumatized. And we call that actually developmental trauma because it disrupts their development, which is different than episodic trauma that happens to a child later in life who's had a really healthy system, healthy background, healthy environment, and healthy supports. Very different children. Does that help?
Yeah, so it sounds like there's sort of a spectrum, but that spectrum, the event may be more or less traumatic based on the sort of priors that any given person who's experiencing that event. So somebody who had less trauma or less genetic predisposition or has a better internal system to deal with such events might not view one thing as traumatic, whereas somebody who had the different kind of upbringing that you sort of described there might see and view and experience an event as traumatic that the other person didn't. Is that correct?
Well, it's not even view. It's not a conscious choice, Drew. I'm glad you said that. It's the autonomic nervous system and the reptilian brain, the part of our brain for thinking, shuts down when there's a traumatic event. Thank goodness. And the part of our brain that releases the hormones for self-protection and defense from the lower circuitry of the brain, the amygdala, which is in the midbrain, and the circuitry with the brain stem that also activates our cerebellum, which is the part of the brain that has reflexive movement for running, fleeing, pushing, jumping, hiding, holding on, ducking, covering. That part of the nervous system goes into action immediately when there's danger. Whether the child had a resilient nervous system or they didn't, unless they're so shut down that they just die. I mean, there's some children, after they've had enough traumatic events, they will have failure to thrive, especially younger children and babies, and they will just die. If they have enough traumatic events that shut their whole nervous system down. It's sort of like playing possum. It's not really playing possum. The possum can't really run fast. I don't know if you have them in Kentucky.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But they are slow. And their only defense is to emit an anal odor and to be completely frozen. Mm-hmm. And I actually learned that from Peter Levine, and I tested the theory. One time my dog was barking and I let him out, and there was a possum, and I actually let him out to see what would happen. And the possum stopped moving when the dog approached and went into his frozen state. And my dog sniffed him and ran as fast as he could away in the other direction. So that defensive response, every child has a little different defensive response depending on their strength, their size. I was actually working with somebody who there was a kidnapping of a group of kids from a preschool, and they all escaped. But I worked with the person in charge of helping them, and almost every one of them had anxiety and couldn't sleep, and restlessness and nightmares when they could sleep. And that's normal after something as frightening as that. And I help them to access the wisdom of their body and to feel their circuitry for how they escaped, and to emphasize the escape rather than the event and what their body did, and to allow their body to feel the activation of that moment of them actually getting away. And some of them still felt like running. So you have them run in place. You can play a game of it, especially with a group of kids. It's actually a lot of fun. Okay, let's all run away together as a group. And if there's somebody in the group that can't run very fast, let's be kind and hold their hand, because the kids were different ages, and see if we can help them to run faster. So together, we run fast, and then we stop, and then we can feel ourselves shaking and our hearts beating. And then we allow ourselves to sit down and talk about how we feel now that it's over, and put our hand maybe on our heart and a hand on our throat if our throat is if we feel our neck pulsating from the blood, and see how powerful our bodies can be, that we were able to escape. And now it's time for our bodies to come back to a resting state. So together we can get ready for our snack time. Because you see, we need to come down to a very grounded state of calmness before we can even digest our food. So we don't want to leave kids with the excitement of triumph. We want to leave them with that, but then also have them come back to a state of not hyperactivity, but a state of joy and groundedness and connection.
So,
you know?
So I'm reminded of my years teaching psychology and Harry Harlow and the videos of the little, I guess if I'm remembering them correctly, a little monkey and a sort of cloth.
Yeah, the chimpanzees. I have those videos actually.
Yeah. And then I think there were studies as well with, if I'm remembering that correctly, some orphanages in Russia or something that was connected as well, that where they didn't have the comfort, the contact that I know you mentioned in the book multiple times, and how that would, I guess, create a level of stress that would lead to a heightened level of fragility. Is that sort of accurate?
That's right. And maybe not fragility in the sense of collapse, which would be a different type of fragility, but it could be aggression. Because they didn't receive human touch, you really can't develop the circuitry for being fully human and feeling the connectivity through the heart without touch. Our hands are attached to our arms, which are attached to our shoulders, which are attached to our pectoral muscles, which are attached to everything surrounding our heart. And we show love through our hands, whether it's handing someone a cookie that we just baked, or shaking their hand, or hugging them and soothing them when they're upset. If the baby didn't have that touch, and also together with the touch, the rhythm of rocking and holding and feeling safe, because the adult that's holding them is regulated when the child is upset. This is like probably the most important note. So I'm going to repeat it of the whole interview. The key is that the caregiver, whether it be teacher, mom, dad, grandma, neighbor, volunteer, the caregiver needs to be free of stress in that moment and feel themselves grounded and regulated. So when they make contact with putting their hand on the back of a child or their shoulder to soothe them, or sitting down and holding both hands and looking into their eyes and letting them know it's over. The bad thing was horrible and I'm here. And together we are going to resolve the yucky feelings by just sitting together. And I'm going to help you to feel in your body that it really is over by being with you so that you're not alone. And the child, knowing that they're not alone, is going to work only if the adult is regulated. If the adult is equally as stressed as the child and their nervous system is going haywire, and this can be very normal. Say in the case of the Southeast Asian tsunami, or in 911, the terrorist attack, the people that have been involved in it have a certain degree of trauma, even if they're resilient. It's normal for them to go into shock. It's how our nervous system protects us from literally falling apart. And so that's why it's important for groups outside of the immediate traumatic event to come in and give assistance to the caregivers first, so they can come out of shock. In the case of, now we're not talking about developmental trauma, we're talking about crises, where there's more and more of that nowadays. And that's why I dedicated chapter 9 to crises, working first aid for traumatic events with whole classrooms, because and going in and supporting the teachers to help them become regulated first, so that they can assist the children. It's like on the airplane, they say, okay, if you have a child with you and we're having trouble, we need to land quickly, or we need oxygen, and the oxygen masks come. What's the first thing they say, Drew? Do you remember? Have you been on a plane lately with the pandemic? Do you remember what?
I haven't been on a plane since March, no.
But do you remember what the steward or the stewardess tells us?
Help the child next to you before you help yourself, or no, help yourself before you.
Yeah, I'm glad you mixed it. I'm glad you mixed it up, because they say for the adult to put the oxygen mask on first. Right. Because what's the first thing that we think? We want to protect our young, right? If we're normal, we want to protect the young. And so our first impulse as caregivers is to put the mask on the child. But no, the adult needs to be there to help the child, and the adult needs to have the oxygen first. First of all, their lungs are bigger. So you want to support the adult to support the child.
So I want to make sure, or I'm curious, as you're talking about a couple things. One, I would say of myself that I have been incredibly fortunate to not have a whole lot of trauma in my life. One life event in the last 3 or 4 years that was fairly traumatic, but certainly not in my formative years. I'm 51 now, so I suppose I'm still forming, but certainly not in my...
Oh, yes, you are.
Certainly not in my neonatal stage or anything like that. But I'm curious, and I don't know if you're familiar with the work by Paul Bloom, his book called Against Empathy, which is, he sort of jokes that's the worst title ever. But I'm curious if, and you may not know the answer to this, it just strikes me as an interesting piece. I'm a fairly rational person, rational, logical person, and if you put that on a scale versus rational versus emotional, it's not that I'm not empathetic, and he makes a distinction between cognitive empathy and emotional empathy, and I think that's an important distinction, and even compassion. But I'm wondering if there's any connection or correlation between people, for example, myself, who did not, as far as I'm aware of, didn't have any particular events that or pre-existing conditions before birth or anything like that would leave me more exposed or more open to this kind of trauma. And I wonder if that kind of my kind of background, for example, it has any correlation with being more rational, logical, and perhaps less emotionally empathetic. I would say I'm cognitively empathetic. I understand what people are going through, but I don't feel that pain for them in ways that I think, from a rational, logical perspective, can sometimes lead you to make some bad decisions. So I'm curious if you have any thinking on that or research or understanding.
I have a lot of understanding on that, and I knew that you were a thinker because the title of your podcast has the word thought right in it, and I have to admit that I'm a thinker too. And it wasn't until I met Peter Levine and studied with him in 1994, I began my studies with him, and I've been studying ever since, how to come out of the thinking brain, which is really important, right, for learning, but it's not as important as we used to think for dealing with life and relationships. It's great for school learning, but school learning, I believe, the social emotional learning that happens in school is just as important, if not more so, than the academic learning. That's why I call this book a movement, a heart-centered movement to wire well-being, because sometimes the most academically successful kids end up suiciding. They end up addicted. They end up having fabulous careers and using meth and crystal meth and cocaine and not being able to sustain relationships. I'm not criticizing divorce, but I'm divorced myself, but they get divorced and they end up not even being able to connect with their children after divorce. They get shut down. So we were programmed with a mammalian brain for connecting and cooperating, and a prefrontal cortex also to make eye contact and to use our thinking brain to use our words for kindness. But we also need to be able to have more depth, more soul, of more than going beyond understanding, actually be able to feel and put ourselves in the shoes of another person through our sensation, our sensing, feeling body, and our emotional self. And unfortunately, trauma shuts those circuitry down. And I don't know your background and how you do. I always thought I had great relationships, and as I learned more about the sensing, feeling body, I didn't realize how much those relationships were based on intellectual conversations, mutual interests, and not really doing what I call now deep listening to what my friends even may be going through. I listen to the words, I use words of empathy, but I never really listened deeply to ask more questions, to see what the person might need from me other than words, to be able to soothe that person without being intrusive. Does that make sense? And I have relationships now that are so depthful. I'm in my 70s, Drew. When I look back to my 50s, I think, where was I? Who was I? What was that all about?
Well, I'm 51. I'm wondering that most days, anyways.
Yeah. And when I see kids in school now, and they have such an extra load of stress, even before the pandemic, with cyberbullying. I mean, I don't know that there's actually less violence in the world, believe it or not, now than there was earlier. It
Sure.
just seems like there's more because we're exposed to it and bombarded with fake news, with real news. We're bombarded with social media, and I'm really worried about our kids being exposed to that without adult supervision, and the adults being exposed to it. The best trauma prevention, I think, is to shut off the social media for anything that has to do with news, and only use it for learning, like with podcasts that are geared for learning, not geared for hurtful things.
Well, I would agree with you there. I don't share much optimism that we're going to see a shift in behavior there, but I definitely agree.
Yeah, empathy is one of my passions. We discovered circuitry, not me personally, but the book is loaded with evidence-based ways to increase empathy in individuals. Now, we don't want to have compassion fatigue and too much empathy for a person without recognizing their resources and helping them to access hidden resources or buried resources or resources that got dampened from their own trauma. We have to work with an empowerment model and see every individual in front of us as their biological gift is that they are resilient. And so any kind of help means helping them to tap into their own resilience and not trying to fix them. This is not a way to, we're not supposed to be fixing people. It doesn't help them. It makes them dependent.
Well, I think that's an interesting segue to one of the things that you note in the book, and just as to sort of close the thread that we were just on there, I do think it's an interesting dynamic that you mention, is that the perception of the world as being more dangerous, more racist, more, whatever version of that sort of threat, those threats that are very real. There is violence, there is racism, there are these, sort of sexisms and whatever, again, list you want to have, add to that, whatever you want to add to that list. But the perception is that it has increased so greatly, and that doesn't often meet with reality. And so there's a epistemological crisis of what we believe to be true. And I think that's an interesting segue to one of the pieces talking about developing resilience and not learning to cope, but as best the way that I sort of frame it and think about is, and this is not fixing people, but it is helping them be more secure with who they are. And I think the framework of Maslow's hierarchy that has recently been revamped and updated by Scott Barry Kaufman in his book Transcend is a good framework to think about, is that when people are, one, really secure with themselves and emotionally healthy, they, I would assume, are more resilient. It's intuitive to me that they're more resilient and also better able to help those who are not. And that also relates to our schools and our teachers. And, we see this kind of yelling at each other on social media, yelling at each other on TV, yelling at anybody in person who doesn't agree with or is saying something or doing something that is counter to what we think is right or true or something like that. And I feel like if we could get a society and our world to be more mentally healthy and secure and okay with who they are, which is full of faults. We're all flawed human beings. We all have shortcomings. None of us are perfect. Some of us are stronger in certain areas. Others are stronger in other areas. But we're all humans. We're all flawed. And recognizing the value of each other as individuals, that then we would be so much more resilient to the things, and as a byproduct, probably have less traumatic, trauma-inducing events.
Amen to that, Drew. That's why I call the book a heart-centered movement, because underlying emotional regulation is the circuitry for our instinctual brain and of the lower circuitry of the brain. Because if a person isn't able to be in their senses and feel the instincts and incomplete responses to trauma, what happens is stress builds up. They don't get to release the stress. And what happens is they become emotionally dysfunctional because there's too much stress in the physiology. See, what I'm proposing is that we look not just at the emotional center and the thinking centers of the brain, but we look at the underlying physiology that runs the show. It's the part of the brain that runs the show and directs whether we have impulsive behaviors that criticize and are violent to others, or whether we can make an assessment, is this real or not real? Those circuitry comes from physiology, from our fight and flight instincts. So a child that's acting out, an adult that's aggressive, they're not thinking. Their impulsive behaviors I mean, I'm not saying there's nothing premeditated. There are some premeditated things, but they're acting from fear. Their fear circuitry in the amygdala lights up and is on fire, and they see others as attackers.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? They see they see the other, whether they look different, they're from a different socioeconomic group, a different part of the country, a different political, religious, racial background, gender orientation, sexual orientation. They see the other as the enemy, and that's fear-based.
Yeah, so that's an interesting, so you say enemy, and I did a little experiment recently. We're in Kentucky, and our governor, like many governors, has imposed some additional restrictions related to COVID, one of them being sort of closing down all the restaurants in Kentucky to in-person dining. And there's certainly an argument to be made for whether that's an overreach or not, and you know, that my point is not to highlight or question whether that is or isn't, but one of our Kentucky legislators posted something about, you know, essentially pushing back and saying we can't allow this kind of sort of tyranny or something like that, right? And again, I'm not trying to take a position one way or the other, but what I did was post a tweet that said something like this, which was, I can't find a sensible reason to dine in an establishment in an enclosed area. Now, as a matter of fact, last night I dined at a restaurant in an outside seating area. So I'm certainly, you know, I want to make it clear, I'm all in favor of getting takeout or, you know, sitting outside, and I know that this is a stress on restaurants and other places, but my point was not that we should open restaurants or close restaurants, but I just can't find myself a sensible reason to. It's not the reward isn't worth the risk of infection for me and or others. The responses were what I was really interested in, and of course I got hundreds of responses. Many of them were pretty nasty. You know, they were associating me with Gavin Newsom, who I know you're familiar with, the governor of California, who was at the French Laundry, and I mean, calling me names and all this stuff. And it was obvious that they viewed me as the enemy because I was even remotely defending, or I mean, I wasn't defending. I was just sort of pointing it out.
It sounds like you were just offering your opinion, and that was different. And
yeah.
That it's really sad, and maybe it should be a heart-centered movement to rewire against nastiness and for cooperation. But you know what? Our biological brain is actually, in addition to being wired from birth for survival, the first survival strategy in mammals, or especially human mammals, is for affiliation and cooperation, because our prefrontal cortex is wired to get along with others. But the 8 essentials include face-to-face communication with eye contact, good eye contact, soothing tone of voice, and some sort of a holding rhythm. And I think with social media, with Twitters and everything, we're not seeing people. Sometimes we're not even hearing people or reading what people are saying. Sometimes they're bots.
Yeah.
And sometimes if they are people, a lot of them are people, we don't know them as people. We just know them as something that's in cyberspace. And that's damaging the circuitry that actually was created in our prefrontal cortex for connection.
Well, to your point, I responded to, I don't know, 5 or 6 or probably less than 10, and several of them, after a few exchanges back and forth where I kind of went a little bit more, I didn't respond with any similar vitriol. I even said, I'm not the enemy. And several of them, after kind of realizing, and this is the point of the human-to-human connection, the reality of what happens when we experience each other as humans and not something different, several of them said, "Oh, I understand what you're saying. I'm so sorry I responded that way." And they, and certainly not of the hundreds, and I'm not going to respond to 100 people, but it was an interesting experiment. And of course, social media is the amplification of all of those dynamics. I do want to, before we sign off, and I know you have in your book the 8 essentials of healthy attachment, which is kind of a theme that goes through the different chapters and the ways in which you think about schools and teachers and things like that. But one thing that I do wonder about that is maybe a bit more specific here is a piece. It's on page 206. And so you mention, and I agree with this, that emotions serve a biological purpose. They're not there to be judged. Feelings aren't good or bad, right or wrong. And so I agree with that, but I also wonder, as a sort of corollary, is how do you think about sort of overreaction, or the sort of like don't cry over spilled milk kind of dynamic? I mean, I have on occasion had my daughters react what I thought was, you're crying over spilled milk, and say, it's okay to be upset, but I'm not sure that this is the kind of thing that is worth, really being in tears for 2 days, or, something like that. So, is there sort of a magnitude of reaction that you think about?
Well, there can be a hypervigilance that comes from 2 different sources. It could come from an earlier trauma, and so the amygdala is geared up to see danger bigger than it is. I was a couples therapist for years and years before I retired, and it was always about blaming the other. And always, when I started working with each of the individuals, their childhood came up with how they didn't get enough of their needs met from their parent. And with children, sometimes it's a bid for attention, but does that mean it's wrong? No. It means that the child is missing something, and to just acknowledge, for example, actually this was a master educator, I'm forgetting her name now. I think I have her in the book from, it was 3 decades ago that I learned from her. She ran the teacher education program at UCLA, Madeline Hunter. And what she said was, if a child comes in from the playground and they scrape their knee, because teachers, elementary especially, act as school nurses, mothers, fathers, grandparents, as well as teachers. She said, it may look like nothing to the adult. And it could be that it is nothing physically. But maybe the child got laughed at, or maybe the child doesn't have parents that soothe and it just wants to make connection. This is an opportunity for the teacher to say, oh, and look at it, and to actually assess it really, and say, you know what, you're going to be okay. Let's go wash that up. I don't know about Kentucky, but in Long Beach, each teacher, I was lucky, the school I was at, there's a sink, for doing cleanup from artwork. Let's go clean that up and make it. And would you like to put a Band-Aid on yourself, or would you like me to? And just to make that contact with the child stops crying. And I said, it's not bleeding very much. You're going to be okay. They may never have had reassurance at home, and that's all they want is an adult's attention. And it's okay to give that attention, because it heals something inside on the emotional level and makes that child feel loved. And usually when you do that, they stop crying immediately. If you say, oh, that's not a big deal, what are you crying about? What happens is they'll start crying louder. Yes, it is a big deal, right? So you need to attune to the child and where they are, and let them know that you acknowledge their pain, whether it's emotional or physical. You assess the situation, you let them know that you're there for them, and then all of a sudden they'll go something like, oh, yeah, it's not a big deal. It doesn't even hurt anymore. Thank you. So we have human needs to be seen. And especially with children that didn't have parents that are there for them, like you may be, Drew, to let the child know that they're seen, they're cared about, they're loved. And then it heals not just the slight scratch or whatever, or the tease, it heals them on an emotional level. And it helps to rewire the circuitry for them doing the same thing for somebody else.
Right. So the 8 essentials of healthy attachment are safety, containment, and warmth, soft mutual eye gazing for infants, contact with kind eyes for students. 3, shared attention, intention, and focus. 4, skin-to-skin bonding for infants and nurturing touch for children. And when I read that part, I remember the advice as a high school teacher, people telling me, don't hug your kids or your students, which certainly in a legal sense is good advice, but it's like, come on now. Sweet, soothing sounds and rhythmic movement. 6, synchronized movements and facial gestures. 7, pleasure, smiles, play, and laughter and fun, or equals fun. And then the 8th one, alternation between quiet and arousing, stimulating activities. And you have that in several of the pieces in it. This book is broken down into 3 parts. So the basics and the roadmap, and you've got some models for building resilience that I found were interesting and useful. The second part, the heartfelt attitudes and tools for transforming, and you talk about ADD and ADHD and some aggression and depression and anxiety, and again, insecurity and mindfulness certainly come up, and I'm a big fan of those kinds of things. And then the third part, special topics, so disaster aid and social trauma, and then some I think useful appendices. And so if folks are interested, where should they find more information, or what would you like to make sure they are aware of?
Well, I have a website. It's maggiekline.com, www.maggiekline.com. I guess that's what it is. Yeah, I think it's a .com. It's very simple. They just have to spell my name right, because Kline can be spelled probably 12 different ways. It's Kline, and Maggie is Maggie. I don't really have a mailing list on that. It's really to show play shops that I teach internationally and in the United States. I've had many educators come to play shops. And right now they're on postponement because of COVID, because most of them I have to fly to. But my organizers around the world have asked me to put something up virtually. And so I'm working to design that, because my play shops are very experiential. They really help educators and mental health workers to feel in their body the different states of activation in a pleasurable way, and how to deactivate the circuitry that leads to lack of impulse control, and how to calm down. So it's very experiential, and it's hard to do experiential on virtually. So I'm working on it. I have a group of kids I might be able to film, if the weather's permitting, of some of the activities, so that teachers and mental health workers can watch and imagine feeling what the group is feeling. So I'm planning to have a virtual product up by March. And teachers are welcome to join my play shops. I also do consulting for different school districts. I'm consulting with several districts right now. One is I'm consulting with people from the school district that actually have taken somatic experiencing classes and are willing to support a wellness program. And they know a little bit about my work already. If they're mental health workers, I highly suggest they go to www.traumahealing.org out of Boulder, Colorado, which is the somatic experiencing website, where they can now take classes virtually and become a somatic experiencing practitioner. It's a 3-year training program, but it's only 12 days a year. It's well, it depends on what country you're in. Is this podcast mostly for the US? So it's usually taught in 3 modules per year over a 4-day weekend, but they changed the format since it's too hard for people to sit in front of a screen that long. I'm no longer teaching somatic experiencing. I'm almost 74, and I'm only teaching in Taiwan right now, virtually, to mentor Chinese-speaking teacher to take over in that part of Asia, and the Chinese Mandarin-speaking part. Well, not even Mandarin, all of any kind of Chinese. We have people from Hong Kong. They speak Cantonese, but all the written Chinese is in Mandarin. So I'm training other people to take over, kind of a legacy. But that's if they want to study somatic experiencing. If they want to learn more from me, the best thing to do is PlayShop, to sign up for PlayShop. And I'm not taking any signups right now because I'm not teaching anything in the United States until I fulfill my commitments to like 25 other organizers that have been waiting for me to finish the book so I can start teaching them again. So I have full classes all over the world that are waiting for me to make a virtual product. But I would say in March, they can contact me. I'd prefer actually that they just wrote to me, and I'll make a mailing list at magita747@gmail.com and tell me that they're interested to be put on a mailing list, because the mailing list link does not work on my website. They want to be on a virtual list for a PlayShop when I start doing that in the United States. I wouldn't suggest, they can't really do it in a foreign country because it's taught in a foreign language. So
Gotcha.
They would have to wait till I do one in the US.
Okay. Well, it is MaggieKline.com. So MaggieKline.com. Of course, we'll put that in the show notes. And if you're listening on iTunes, then you'll have to go to one of those places where we have it on TeachThought.com or WeGrowTeachers.com, or you can just go to MaggieKline.com. Maggie, certainly a pleasure talking with you. The book is Brain Changing Strategies to Trauma-Proof Our Schools, and in the downtime between when COVID will allow you to travel freely and do the work in person, folks can get the book on Amazon and places at your website lists. So certainly not a small book, lots of information there and lots of things to work through and consider for folks who are working in schools and working with trauma related issues, which is probably all of us. So thanks so much.
Yeah, it is all of us. I'd like to say one other thing that when I have play shops, I'm so happy when I get administrators, vice principals and principals and other people that help with policy, because I really do want this to be a movement of changing. So many of the suggestions I make are for the entire classroom. So, and some of the suggestions are for the entire school, that they can do these activities through their public address system. I know right now we're in lockdown, but to be thinking about the future when the vaccine's in place and the kids go back to school, they would need this to help them reintegrate to become more settled, because it's going to be difficult. Transitions for kids are sometimes very difficult. So anyway, Blessings to you, blessings to all the educators out there. I've been teaching by Zoom with Taiwan, and it's exhausting. I really empathize with anybody that is teaching by screen time right now every day. It's a long haul.
It is indeed.
Blessing, thank you for hanging in there for our children. They're our most precious possessions for our future.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Maggie.
Okay, Drew.
That'll do it for today's podcast episode. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to review us and share us on your network so we can grow our audience to better meet your needs. Also, don't forget to find us on our websites, TeachThought.com and WeGrowTeachers.com, as well as our various social media outlets.